Hey everybody, I'm excited to dive into our study of the United Kingdom with you. Can you meet me in 2 Samuel chapter 2? We've got a lot of ground to cover. We have noticed in our survey the rise and fall of Israel's first king, Saul. We've been introduced to Israel's second king, David. We're going to watch over the next few weeks as the kingdom of Saul, you can see where he reigned, expands even more under David. David is a mighty king in Israel, but I need you to notice as we kick off in 2 Samuel 2, even though David had been anointed by Samuel as the next king in Israel, all the way back in 1 Samuel 16, he was not recognized by all of Israel for quite some time. Saul has died by the time we get to 2 Samuel chapter 2. Let's pick up the reading in verse 4, where our narrator tells us that the men of Judah, what tribe was David from? He was of the tribe of Judah, and the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over not all of Israel, but over the house of Judah. In fact, in verse 8, we read about the commander of Saul's army. Saul has died, but the commander of his army, named Abner, is still very much alive. Abner takes one of Saul's sons named Ishbosheth, and he makes him king over Gilead and various tribes. In fact, over all Israel. So get this in your mind. You've got David down here to the south, who has been anointed king over the house of Judah. But Judah is just one tribe in Israel, right? Saul's commander has taken one of Saul's sons and anointed him as the king over the rest of Israel. As a result, we're going to read about a lot of tension in the first few chapters between Israel and Judah. Notice in verse 10, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel. And this went on for 2 years. Meanwhile, the house of Judah follows David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. It's not surprising that 2 Samuel 3 begins by telling us there was a long war. Even though Saul has died, there's a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. The next several chapters really chronicle with a lot of bloodshed, how David grows stronger and stronger while the house of Saul becomes weaker and weaker. For now, look at 2 Samuel chapter 5, where eventually this civil war grows and grows, and ultimately David comes out stronger. And so in verse 1, all the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron and say, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." They're tired of the fighting. We're all descendants of Abraham. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. David was a great military leader. And the Lord said to you, "You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king, to David at Hebron, where he had been reigning, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king, finally, over Israel. He was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigns for the next 40 years. Down here at Hebron, He reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. At Jerusalem, he reigns over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. You see, he didn't start reigning at Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem doesn't even belong at this point to the children of Israel. Notice in verse 6, the king, David, and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. You see, way up high in the hills of Judea, there were people, Canaanites, who had been there all along, and they sure thought they were safe. They lived in a small walled city. They were known as Jebusites, but this is where David wants to make his capital. And so he says in verse 6, he and his men, they go against the Jebusites. The inhabitants of the land have been saying to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David, he can't breach our walls. He can't take this elevated city. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold. Notice how it's called here, Zion. That is the city of David. Verse 8 even tells us how. He tells his men, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him go up the water shaft. David knows we probably can't get over these walls, but if we go through the shaft of water, we'll be able to go up into the city. They take it. David lives in the stronghold that comes to be known as the city of David. He builds it up. He becomes greater and greater as Israel's second king, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. We need to talk for a moment about what happens in chapter 6, where David again gathers all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. He arises, they go with all each other to bring up the ark of God, that ark of the covenant, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. They're carrying the ark on a new cart pulled by oxen. They bring it out of the house of Aminadab, which was on the hill. There are two sons of Aminadab. One of them is named Uzzah. They're driving this new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio goes before the ark, and David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord. Verse 6, they come to the threshing floor of Nacon, and as the oxen stumble, Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark, to take hold of it, and the anger of the Lord is kindled against Uzzah, and God strikes him down there. This is an error. He dies there before the ark of God. David is angry because the Lord has broken out against Uzzah, and in verse 9, he's even afraid of the Lord. He wonders, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? I'm the king in Israel. How can I get this ark over to me? Well, God had provided a method for moving the ark, right? What was that? We'll talk about that as a class. For now, notice in chapter 7, as David the king lives in his house, God has given him rest on all sides. The king, David, says to Nathan the prophet, see, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan the prophet says to David, go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. Well, who hasn't been asked? God hasn't been asked. And we might talk together as a class. God has a plan for the building of a permanent house, but that plan is not for David to build it. And yet, I want to zero in with you before we kick it to your in-person class teacher, verses 12 and 13 of 2 Samuel 7. God promises David, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, after you've died, I will raise up for your offspring after you someone who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That sounds like a really important promise. The next chapter or two talks about David's military conquest, the kingdom growing. For now, let's end in 2 Samuel 9, where David asked, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there is someone, a son named Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was lame in his feet. He can't walk, and he's called before the king. Undoubtedly, as he presents himself before David, he's terrified. But David tells him in verse 7 of 2 Samuel 9, don't fear, I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. Mephibosheth, a lame descendant of an old king, knows he's not worthy. But 2 Samuel 9 verse 13 tells us he lived right there in Jerusalem. He ate always at the king's table, even though he was lame in both his feet. David and his reign have given us a lot to talk about. So let's do that together. Thanks for being in class. Hope you have a great rest of your class and a great rest of this week.